December 18, 1944. A frozen foxhole near Bastogne, Belgium. The sky is a hard gray, thick with falling snow. Silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the occasional distant rumble of artillery. Inside the foxhole, Corporal Eddie Voss huddles, his breath visible in the biting cold. His frozen fingers grip the headset, pressing it tighter against his ears as static fills the air. A new voice cuts through the crackling noise. German. It's not the usual chatter of soldiers, but something far more dangerous. Coordinates. Not for his own men, but for the American positions. Eddie's heart stops as the words sink in. The Germans are coming. 40 tanks moving west, right towards a sleeping battalion of American soldiers, only 2 miles away. He knows the drill. He's been ordered to never broadcast on enemy frequencies. It's a court-martial offense, but his mind races. In the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, every second counts. If he does nothing, his comrades will be crushed by the German advance. But if he acts, he risks everything. His life, his career, his honor. With one quick, instinctive motion, Eddie opens his mouth. His German is flawless. Every word shaped by years of listening to his parents' old language. The risk is unimaginable, but so is the consequence of silence. In that moment, Eddie Voss is no longer just a radio operator. He is the thread that might unravel an entire army's advance. The air is thick with tension as he begins to speak, breaking every rule, choosing the lives of his comrades over his own future. December 16, 1944. The dead of winter. The Battle of the Bulge was in full force, a last-ditch effort by Adolf Hitler to turn the tide of the war in the West. The German High Command had devised a plan, a brutal counteroffensive that would strike through the Ardennes forest, exploiting the thinly held American lines. The weather was cold, freezing the soldiers to their bones, and the ground was muddy, churned up by constant movement. But there was something worse than the weather, something invisible, an overwhelming sense of chaos. Hitler's strategy was desperate, relying on speed, surprise, and the full might of the German Wehrmacht. They would push through the American defenses, break their lines, and capture the vital supply depot at Bastogne, which lay at the crossroads of key supply routes. The Germans would have the fuel they needed to keep fighting, and the Allies would be cut off. It was a perfect plan, or so it seemed. The American forces, stretched thin after a brutal campaign, were unprepared. The 101st Airborne, along with other units, found themselves surrounded in the town of Bastogne. In those first days of battle, their communication lines were shattered, command systems disrupted, and every piece of intelligence that could be gathered seemed critical. The fog of war hung heavy, and the defenders of Bastogne were left to rely on what they could see with their eyes and hear through their radios. Eddie Voss was one of the men in that frozen landscape, buried in a foxhole as the offensive continued. He was a signal operator, far removed from the front lines of combat, yet his role had never felt so crucial. In the midst of battle, when traditional means of communication were severed, the radio became the lifeline between survival and annihilation. For Eddie, it was a world of static, frequencies, and fleeting messages, none of which should have mattered beyond routine. But on this cold winter night, as German tanks rumbled through the distance, Eddie's world would become something far more dangerous. Eddie Voss had been born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the son of German immigrants who had fled the chaos of post-World War I Europe. His parents spoke German at home, and Eddie grew up listening to the sounds of the language, absorbing not just its structure, but the nuances of dialects and regional accents. He spoke perfect German, a skill that would make him stand out in the army and lead him to an unlikely position during the war. When Eddie enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1943, he was tested for his linguistic skills and found to be fluent in German. His proficiency in both the language and its cultural subtleties caught the attention of the Army's Signals Intelligence Division. But instead of being placed in a comfortable desk job where he would translate intercepted German communications in safety, Eddie found himself on the front lines, assigned to the 101st Airborne Division as a radio operator. It was an ironic twist of fate. Eddie was a field operator, tasked with maintaining and operating radio equipment, fixing broken transmitters, and relaying coordinates. The reality of his position was far from glamorous. He spent his days in freezing foxholes, huddled with his equipment, trying to stay warm as the world around him seemed to disintegrate. The war felt distant, abstract, a world away from his days at the Milwaukee Electric Railway, where he'd troubleshoot electrical systems. But as the Battle of the Bulge began, Eddie's unique talents would become an unexpected asset. The American lines were buckling under the German onslaught. In the confusion, radio communication lines were severed, and the ability to coordinate between units became increasingly difficult. This was where Eddie's role became pivotal. Despite the strict military protocols surrounding radio operations, Eddie's natural curiosity and problem-solving mindset led him to do something that no one would expect of a disciplined soldier. He began listening to enemy radio chatter, something forbidden under Army regulations, but something that would soon become the key to saving countless lives. The Army's Signals Division had clear rules about radio monitoring. Operators were only supposed to listen to Allied frequencies, relaying messages up the chain of command and ensuring operational security. Listening to enemy frequencies was not only a waste of resources, but could also feed disinformation into the system, something the Germans exploited frequently. The stakes were high, but to Eddie it was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. His mind worked in patterns, whether it was tracking down a malfunctioning circuit or deciphering the rhythms of the German military's communication systems. He could hear the flaws, the gaps, the repetitions in the enemy's transmissions, and he began to log them piece by piece. For 3 days, Eddie listened, curious, cautious, and growing more and more aware of the dangerous potential of what he was hearing. German tank crews reporting positions, infantry calling for reinforcements, artillery adjustments, fragments of information that, when pieced together, painted a clear picture of the German operations around Bastogne. Eddie knew the terrain, he knew the Germans' tactics, and he could hear something that no one else could. The panzers were moving, and they were moving straight toward an American fuel depot where 300 men slept, unaware of the impending threat. As Eddie sat in his frozen foxhole, listening to the faint crackle of the German radio transmissions, he found himself in an unimaginable position. His mind raced between his duty to the Army and his personal instincts. Every rule he'd been trained to follow screamed at him to stop, to do nothing, to stay in line and report only on authorized frequencies. But his gut told him otherwise. He wasn't just a soldier in a vast impersonal war machine. He was a man with a deep understanding of the very language the enemy spoke. A son of immigrants who'd learned the cadence of German at his grandmother's knee. In those words, Eddie heard not just the plans of the Germans, but a connection to his own past, to the voices of his family, to the stories of his parents' escape from Nazi-controlled Europe. There was a chilling irony in hearing the enemy speak his own language, as if fate had woven his life into the fabric of this war. But now, that language was being used to bring death closer to his comrades. The German tanks were moving toward the fuel depot, toward the 300 American soldiers who had no idea that their lives hung by a thread, and Eddie felt an overwhelming responsibility to act. He could do nothing, stay silent, and follow the rules. Or he could break every military protocol, step into the shoes of the enemy, and gamble with the lives of hundreds, including his own. The moral weight of this decision pressed heavily on Eddie's shoulders. He thought of the 300 men sleeping soundly, trusting that their commanders had taken the necessary precautions. If he did nothing, they would die without ever knowing how close they had come to survival. He thought of the soldiers who had fought beside him, enduring the same cold, the same isolation, the same uncertainty. Would he risk his life to save theirs? Would breaking the rules, an act of rebellion by all accounts, be justified if it meant saving lives? He knew this was not just a military decision, but a deeply human one. In that foxhole, Eddie wasn't just thinking about tactical advantage or protocol. He was thinking about the faces of his friends, their families, and the fact that if he did nothing, they would never make it home. His heart beat faster as the realization settled in. Sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the easy thing. Sometimes it was the most dangerous. Eddie's eyes fell on the radio equipment, the same equipment that had been entrusted to him by the Army, the same equipment that, in his hands, could either save lives or doom him. There was no good option, only the one that would haunt him the least. And so, he made a decision that would change everything. He reached for the German radio set. Eddie's understanding of the German communication system was not just an accident of chance, it was a skill honed by years of attention to detail. Unlike his fellow soldiers, Eddie was trained to listen for patterns, to recognize the rhythm of communication. He knew how the Germans operated, how they structured their orders, how their transmissions followed a predictable schedule. He'd spent days logging the frequency, the call signs, and even the peculiarities of individual operators. The Germans, under normal circumstances, were a formidable force. Their communication system was structured, their orders precise, and their operators disciplined. But the Battle of the Bulge had stretched the Wehrmacht thin. Their supply lines were faltering, their equipment was worn, and their personnel were exhausted. The German military, once so rigid and meticulous in its operations, was now cut off, desperate, and prone to making mistakes. In the chaos of war, Eddie realized, the Germans had let down their guard. Their communication protocols were breaking down. They no longer authenticated transmissions with the usual code sequences. They relied instead on voice recognition and familiar rhythms. The Panzer commander Eddie had been listening to for days. A man he had come to think of as Klaus had become predictable. Eddie knew the commander's voice, the cadence of his orders, the slight hesitation when asked to make risky decisions. He knew Klaus's fear of mines, fear born of first-hand experience, a fear that Eddie could exploit. The key to Eddie's plan wasn't just the information he had overheard. It was his ability to understand the psychology of the German commander. Klaus wasn't blindly obedient. He was cautious, calculating, and most importantly, he was human. He questioned orders when they didn't make sense, when they seemed too risky. Eddie had spent hours listening to the pattern of Klaus's decisions. He knew that if he could send orders that were in line with Klaus's expectations, that didn't seem out of place. He could deceive the man without raising suspicion, but Eddie didn't just rely on Klaus's hesitation to manipulate him. He also understood the larger picture. The Germans had become over-reliant on patterns, and those patterns could be exploited. Eddie had memorized the German units, their fuel levels, their movements. He knew that the column heading toward the fuel depot had already been stretched thin. They were low on supplies, and their commander was terrified of losing more tanks to mines. He also knew that the German military, now operating with fewer resources, couldn't afford another defeat. So Eddie crafted the perfect set of orders, plausible, strategic, and, most importantly, consistent with the psychology of the commander. He wasn't telling Klaus to abandon the mission or change course entirely. No, Eddie was simply offering an adjustment that played into Klaus's fears, making it seem like a safer option, a minor tactical shift, one that would lead Klaus and his tanks directly into the minefields where American forces had already laid traps. It was a psychological maneuver that would require precision. Any hesitation or deviation from the usual protocol could raise suspicion. But Eddie was ready. He had studied the German transmission schedules. He knew exactly when Klaus would expect to hear from command, and he knew that timing would be everything. A perfect match to the enemy's communication style. combined with a subtle shift in the tactical objectives, would make the deception almost invisible. As the cold wind howled through his foxhole and the hours slipped away, Eddie knew this was his moment. He had been trained to follow orders, to act within a rigid structure. But here, with a captured German radio and the lives of 300 men on the line, Eddie understood that sometimes the right choice was the one that defied the very system that had been built to protect him. In the coming minutes, he would use the enemy's own protocols to destroy them. It was 2:03 a.m. on December 19, 1944. The snow had fallen steadily through the night, blanketing the world in a thick, silent layer of white. In his foxhole, Eddie Voss could feel the cold creeping through his thick winter gear, but it was the chill in his chest that consumed him. His mind was locked in the final calculation, the last moments before committing an act that would irrevocably alter the course of the battle, and his own future. The captured German radio sat before him, its antenna extended, waiting. Eddie had been meticulously preparing for this moment for days, memorizing frequencies, practicing his German, crafting the exact sequence of words that would mimic the orders Klaus expected. He had studied the German commander's voice, his cadence, his inflection, every hesitation, every pause. Now, Eddie was ready to step into the shoes of the enemy, his mind racing, his hands trembling, but his resolve unshakable. Eddie glanced at his watch. He had precisely 15 minutes, no more. At 2:17 a.m., Klaus would expect orders from German High Command. If Eddie's transmission was too early, the Germans would assume technical failure, or worse, a deception. Too late, and the German tanks would already be on the move, unaware of the trap that awaited them. The window of opportunity was narrow, and every second counted. Eddie adjusted the frequency dial, his fingers cold and stiff. The radio crackled to life, a faint hiss of static before the familiar German voices filled the air. He could hear them talking, German soldiers, reporting the positions of their tanks, confirming their routes. The same voices he had come to know over the past few days. Klaus's voice was there too, calm and measured, but with a slight rasp that had come to define him. Eddie's heart beat faster, but he forced himself to steady his nerves. This was it. He was about to become the voice that would send Klaus and his tanks into oblivion. He keyed the transmitter, waiting for the red light to glow. His mouth was dry. The words he had rehearsed so many times now felt foreign in his mouth. But he didn't hesitate. The voice he used was not his own, but that of a seasoned German officer, deep, authoritative, commanding. The words flowed through him like a weapon. Eisenfußt 4 here. Panzer Group Command, Iron Fist 4. New orders. The radio crackled with silence, a moment of tension, and then Klaus's voice pierced through the static. A relief, and yet a confirmation of just how real the risk had become. Iron Fist 4, ready to receive. Eddie took a deep breath, his mind racing through the next part of the script. The lie had to be flawless, believable, unassailable. He couldn't rush. Real commanders didn't rush. They spoke slowly, deliberately, as if every word they uttered was law. He made himself pause, counting to 3 in his head before continuing. Your current attack route is being changed. There are mines along your original path. American engineers have reinforced positions in the last 12 hours. The mention of mines, the same mines that had claimed so many German tanks in the previous days, was the key. Eddie could almost see Klaus's face as he processed the information. The hesitation he had heard so many times before was there again, but this time there was no question in Klaus's mind. The commander's voice, raspy but clear, came through the static once more. Verstanden. New route, please, Eddie exhaled slowly, the pressure building in his chest. He could feel the weight of the lie pressing on him, but he knew he was playing with fire. Every word he spoke was sealing the fate of the German Panzer Battalion. But the 300 men in the American depot, his comrades, were depending on him. The decision had already been made. There was no turning back. "Change course to 03T5, Eddie continued, rattling off the coordinates he had memorized from his notes. Real American minefields, the ones he had marked days earlier. The coordinates were so precise that the German commander would believe he was being routed to a safer, less defended area. In truth, it was the exact opposite. The silence stretched on for a long moment. Eddie's throat tightened. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But as Klaus responded, his words were measured, calm. Exactly what Eddie had expected. Understood. Iron Fist 4 will execute order. Estimated arrival 0530. End confirmed. With those words, the final nail was driven into the coffin. The tanks would be moving toward a massacre, all because of a voice in the static. A voice that sounded so familiar, so authoritative, that Klaus would never question it. He believed it was the command he had been waiting for. And in that moment, as Eddie released the transmit button and sat back, he realized just how easily a life could be extinguished in the fog of war. He had saved 300 men, but at what cost? Eddie buried the German radio beneath the snow and debris, hiding the evidence of his actions as best as he could. The weight of the deception settled into his bones like the cold, knowing full well that the next few hours would bring chaos. By dawn, the German tanks would be destroyed, not by superior American tactics, but by a voice that spoke with the authority of death. Hours passed in agonizing silence. Eddie sat in his foxhole, staring out at the bleak, snow-covered landscape, his mind replaying the decision he had just made. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of the lives that hung in the balance. Somewhere, far beyond the fog of war, 40 German tanks were slowly moving toward their doom, following orders they believed were legitimate. The trap was set, and in a few hours Eddie would know whether it had worked. But in that moment, all he could do was wait. At precisely 5:32 a.m., the first explosion tore through the stillness of the early morning. It was a deafening sound, a violent rupture in the frozen quiet of the battlefield. Eddie flinched, his hands clenching around the edges of his foxhole. The shockwave rattled the ground beneath him, and the noise echoed through the trees, a reminder that war was always waiting to break the silence with destruction. Then came the second explosion, and the third. They followed in rapid succession, a cascade of detonations that shattered the night, each one more deafening than the last. The German tanks had entered the minefield exactly as Eddie had planned, believing they were flanking an ambush, not realizing that the ambush was their own. The American mines had been carefully laid, designed to destroy any advancing force that came too close. And as the first tank triggered the mines, it was as if the whole German column had been sent to its grave. The powerful explosions tore through the armored vehicles, sending a fiery glow into the cold morning sky. The German tanks, once a formidable threat, were now crumpled husks, burning in the snow. The blast from the first tank was devastating. It ripped through the thin armor, igniting fuel and ammunition in a spectacular fireball. Klaus, the commander Eddie had spent days studying, died instantly in the explosion, his command tank disintegrating under the force of the blast. He never knew the true nature of the orders he had received. He never knew he had been deceived. He believed he was executing a legitimate maneuver, a tactical shift designed to avoid American defenses. In his final moments, Klaus was the victim of a cruel game of psychological warfare, one that Eddie had orchestrated from his frozen foxhole. Within 30 seconds, the first 12 German tanks were destroyed. Their crews perished in the initial explosion, and the rest were trapped, unable to move. The surrounding terrain, once thought to be safe, had become a deadly killing zone. Eddie's plan had worked beyond his wildest expectations, but the destruction was far from over. As the mines continued to tear through the German column, American artillery, alerted by the initial explosions, rained down on the helpless tanks. Within hours, the entire Panzer battalion had been annihilated. The American soldiers, 300 of whom had been sleeping just 2 miles away, never knew how close they had come to death. By the time the sun rose, the German tanks had been reduced to smoking wrecks, scattered across a sector that had been marked as undefended. The only signs of a battle were the burned-out tanks, the twisted metal, and the lingering smell of smoke in the air. As dawn broke, American reconnaissance units moved in to investigate. What they found was a mystery. The Germans had not attacked the fuel depot as expected. They had not flanked the American lines. Instead, they had driven straight into a minefield, destroying themselves in a series of explosions that no one had predicted. There were no American forces in the area. There was no engagement, just the wreckage of a German battalion that had been sent to its death by an invisible hand. The initial confusion among American intelligence was palpable. They knew something had happened, but they couldn't explain it. The Germans had been routed without a shot being fired by American forces. No tactical maneuvers, no coordinated offensive, just a German column destroyed in the blink of an eye by a well-placed series of explosions. Theories began to circulate. Some suggested radio malfunctions, others pointed to the possibility of a German officer having a mental breakdown, but no one could explain it with any certainty. One thing was clear. The Germans had been deceived in a way they couldn't have anticipated. Eddie, however, knew the truth. He had been the one to set the trap. He had played a role in their destruction. He had impersonated the enemy command and lured them to their fate. It wasn't a heroic act, nor a victory to be celebrated. It was a calculated risk, a gamble that had paid off. But as the snow continued to fall, Eddie sat alone in his foxhole, watching the sunrise with a feeling that was far from relief. He had saved 300 men, but he had also sent dozens of others to their deaths. The American soldiers would never know what Eddie had done for them. The story would never be told in the official records, nor would any medal be awarded to him. His actions would remain buried in the cold, silent snow of Belgium, lost to history, known only to those who had heard the German commander's voice in the static. And to Eddie Voss, it didn't matter. The battle had been won, but the cost of victory would haunt him forever. By dawn on December 19, 1944, the German Panzer Battalion was destroyed. The remnants of the tanks, blackened and twisted by the explosion, lay scattered across the frozen landscape. The morning air was thick with smoke, and the occasional distant pop of lingering ammunition could be heard, as the cold silenced the sounds of battle. For the American soldiers who had been sleeping only a few miles away, the explosion was a distant rumble, something they would hear in passing but not fully understand until later. The destruction of the German tanks was a strange victory, one that had come at an incredible cost, yet in a way that defied conventional military strategy. The minefield had worked exactly as it was supposed to, but the Germans had fallen into it because of Eddie Voss's deception. The American command would never know how close they had come to a devastating attack on the depot. There would be no report about the tanks that never arrived. No mention of the attack that never took place. What would be filed in the military records was simple. German tanks had been destroyed by mines. A victory? Yes, but an unexplained one. Eddie Voss's role in the disaster remained invisible, hidden beneath the layers of military bureaucracy and the fog of war. His unauthorized intelligence gathering had led to the deception, but it was not something the Army could ever acknowledge. Breaking radio protocol, impersonating the enemy's command. It was a breach that was unforgivable, a risk that could have led to disaster had the Germans realized what had happened. And yet, because the Germans never discovered the truth, Eddie's actions would remain buried in the deep crevices of military history, unreported, unrecognized. Captain Morrison was the first officer to question Eddie after the attack. By the time he arrived at Eddie's foxhole, the initial reports of the German column's destruction had filtered up the chain of command. The confusion among American intelligence officers was evident. The Germans had been expected to attack the fuel depot, but instead they had destroyed themselves in a minefield. The lack of engagement from American forces left a gap in the official narrative that needed to be filled. Captain Morrison had no answers for the anomaly, but he knew where to start looking: at the unauthorized radio monitoring by Eddie Voss. "You've been listening to enemy frequencies without authorization for 4 days," Morrison had said flatly, his voice like stone. "You've been using captured enemy equipment, gathering intelligence you had no clearance to collect." The words were a matter of procedure, nothing more. The Army operated by rules, and rules were not to be broken. The fact that Eddie had helped save hundreds of American lives was irrelevant. What mattered was that he had acted outside the bounds of military order. Eddie had tried to explain. He had tried to tell Morrison about the tanks, about the German column that was headed for the depot, about how the lives of 300 men had been saved by a radio signal. But the captain would not listen. "For all you know, you've been listening to a deception operation. The Germans know we monitor their frequencies. They feed us disinformation constantly." It was a bitter pill to swallow, especially for Eddie, who had seen the lives that had been spared. But Morrison's mind was made up. There would be no acknowledgement of what Eddie had done, only punishment for breaking protocol. The German radio, the notes, the transmission logs, everything that Eddie had gathered was confiscated, packed up, and taken away. His punishment was swift and severe. He was reassigned immediately, sent to a signals unit in Luxembourg, far from the front lines and away from any further temptation to overstep his bounds. Captain Morrison's last words to Eddie echoed in his mind as the MPs carried away the evidence. "You've crossed a line, Corporal. You'll be lucky if you're not court-martialed." As Eddie sat in his foxhole, the remnants of the German tanks smoldering in the distance, he knew that his actions would never be officially recognized. There would be no medal, no commendation, no gratitude from the Army. His bravery, his defiance, the very thing that had saved lives, was an offense to the very system he had sworn to protect. And the irony was not lost on him. The men who had woken up that morning alive would never know his name, would never hear the truth behind their survival. They would go about their duties, thinking that they had merely been lucky. In a way, they were. In the weeks that followed, the story of the destroyed Panzer Battalion would fade into the background. There would be no official report that could explain the bizarre events that had led to the German tanks' destruction. Military historians would later speculate about the psychological warfare behind the event, but no one would ever piece together the truth of what had happened in that frozen foxhole in Belgium. Eddie's transfer to Luxembourg, away from the front lines, was a quiet exile. He continued to serve in the Army, maintaining communication equipment and training new radio operators, but the shadow of what he had done hung over him. The events of December 18th would not be recorded in any official history. There would be no recognition, no medals, no parades, just an empty space in the records, a hole that would remain unfilled for years to come. After the war, Eddie returned to Milwaukee. He married, raised 3 children, and worked for the phone company, living a quiet life far removed from the horrors of the front lines. He never spoke about the night he had impersonated the enemy, the night he had saved 300 American lives at the cost of dozens of German soldiers. The memories lingered, but they were buried deep within him, a part of his past that never saw the light of day. In the years that followed, historians occasionally noted the strange fate of the Eisenführer battalion. Some speculated that the Germans had fallen victim to an Allied psychological operation. Others dismissed the event as wartime chaos and coincidence. The truth, however, never found its way into the official records. The voice that had spoken through the static, the voice that had deceived the enemy into destruction, would remain anonymous. But Eddie knew the truth. He had been the unseen hand that had turned the tide, and that was enough for him. In the end, Eddie Voss lived out the remainder of his life without fanfare. He died in 1987, at the age of 64 in Milwaukee. His name would never appear in any official history of World War II, but in the quiet moments, in the rare moments of reflection, Eddie would remember the faces of the men he had saved. And that, in the end, was the most important thing. No medals, no accolades, just the knowledge that he had done what was right, even when the world would never know. Eddie Voss's story is one of quiet heroism, an act of bravery that will never be celebrated in parades or etched into the history books. It is a reminder that in war, the line between right and wrong is not always clear. The rules of engagement are meant to protect, to maintain order in the chaos of battle. But sometimes, in the face of human suffering, those rules are not enough. Sometimes, the most important thing is to do what is necessary to save lives, even if it means breaking the very system that was designed to uphold the greater good. Eddie's moral conflict, the choice he faced in that frozen foxhole, is a microcosm of the ethical dilemmas that countless soldiers faced during World War II and throughout all of history. He had been trained to follow orders, to adhere to protocol, to obey commands without question. But as the Germans closed in, as his comrades slept unaware of the impending danger, Eddie understood something that most others did not. The true cost of war was not just measured in lives lost, but in the quiet decisions made by those who, like him, would never be seen as heroes. What Eddie did was not a textbook victory. It was not a triumph of strategy or overwhelming firepower. It was a single, solitary act of defiance against the system that could have cost him everything. But in those moments of uncertainty, when he chose to deceive the enemy, he did more than save lives. He preserved the very essence of humanity in a war that often stripped it away. In the end, war is a brutal, dehumanizing force, one that often requires the kind of sacrifices that are hard to justify or understand. But every so often, there are moments when the choices we make, even in the darkest of times, reflect the best of what it means to be human. Eddie Voss may have never received recognition, may have never been honored for his bravery. But in that foxhole, as he spoke the words that sent 40 German tanks to their doom, he did something that few soldiers are ever asked to do. He decided who would live and who would die. And in that moment, he became a hero, not for the world to see, but for those whose lives he saved. History will not remember Eddie Voss, and perhaps that is fitting. His story is not one of glory, but of quiet sacrifice, of a man who chose to break every rule to do what he believed was right. And in the cold silence of that winter night, his voice in the static, the world changed, not because of a battle won or a leader revered, but because of the choices of one soldier who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns or tanks, but with the courage to break every rule when lives depend on it.